couple of years ago, I hopped in an Uber. We were on a vacation. We were in Park City, Utah. We love to be in the mountains. We love to ski. My girls love to ski, all that kind of stuff. We're in Park City, and I hopped in an Uber because I had to drop somebody off in Salt Lake and drop off the rental car and make an Uber trip back. And I'm one of those cringy guys who sits in the front of the Uber and actually talks to the Uber driver. Because I get weird with silence. If I sit in the back and I'm drinking the drink that they have and not talking, I feel weird. Thankfully, Uber has added a new dimension to Uber. You can pick, I don't want to talk to that person and I want this type of music. But for this period, I was in a talking mood. And so I start talking to this Uber driver and he goes, "Let me ask you a question." He started talking about money. Not like how much money do you make or how much money I make or anything like that. But he started asking a specific question. He said, "Hey, I've got a question. What would you do with $10 million?" And I said, "Why do you ask? That's an interesting question." He said, "Well, I had a lady in my Uber a couple weeks ago. She won the Powerball lottery and she won $10 million. And he goes, I asked her, what are you going to do?" And she goes, "I'm going to move to San Antonio, Texas." And he goes, "I thought that was an interesting thought." I think it's an interesting thought too. I'm a Texan. I grew up in Dallas. I have Texas. You cut me. I bleed Texas. I mean, Texas, just what you think about Texas. It's the greatest state in the union and the people there are great and we can fight bears. That's what you think of Texans. That's what I am. Texans have this specific pride, but San Antonio, it's hot. It's humid. No shade on the Alamo, but it's like if somebody came up and wrote me a $10 million check, which if you're planning to do that, great. I'm not picking San Antonio, Texas. For me, I told him, I said, I would turn the car around and I would go back up to Park City. I'd find a house in the mountains. You know why? Because I love the mountains. There's something about the crisp air. There's something about the smells, the nature, just this beautiful vistas. I love the mountains. And it's not surprising that most of us love those mountaintop experiences because man, for all of his history, has associated mountaintop experiences with God. For instance, if you've ever studied any of the Greek mythologies and the Roman mythologies, that was kind of my favorite genre of literature back in high school. I loved the stories about Zeus and Jupiter, and they all lived on this mountain because they were gods. As a matter of fact, Alexander the Great would go to the real Mount Olympus. And at the base of Mount Olympus, he would offer sacrifices right there in front of the mountain. The gods have always been associated with the mountains, and it was the same for Hebrew culture as well. Think about Abraham offering up a sacrifice of Isaac on a mountain. Think about Moses receiving the words of God in the 10 Commandments on a mountain. The tabernacle, the temple itself, if you've ever been to Jerusalem, sits high on the mountain. And as a matter of fact, the worshipers would start at the bottom of the valley, at the Kidron Valley. And I've walked that walk. And I can tell you, it makes San Francisco, the elevation there, feel like it's on steroids because it's straight up. And can you imagine going up to the temple and worshiping, and you're carrying your family? I can barely carry them through an airport, but you're carrying your family, you're carrying your equipment. You might have a sacrifice. You might have a lamb resting on your shoulders and stepping up over and over and over and over again. What are you to do? Well, the Hebrew people, they got clever and they started writing songs. They're called the Songs of Ascent. We find them in Psalms 1, somewhere around 120 to 134. Let me just read one of them to you, okay? I lift up my eyes up to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He keeps you. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he keeps Israel, will neither sleep nor slumber. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep you. You're going out and you're coming in from this time forth and forevermore. They would sing these songs as they would ascend to the mountains because they believed that God resided on a mountaintop. If you look at Luke chapter 9, Jesus takes his disciples on a mountaintop journey. Here, let me read it to you. Pick up in verse 28. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on a mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered and his clothes became dazzling white. And behold, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and two men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, is it good that we are here? Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. And as he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud, and a voice came out of heaven and saying, This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and no one in those days anything of what, and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. Now, Jesus takes his disciples up on a mountaintop experience, his 3 closest disciples. And what's interesting is if you roll the clock backwards just a little bit and start in Luke chapter 9, he gives all of his disciples another mountaintop experience. He takes them to a place called Caesarea Philippi. Now, Caesarea Philippi is way on the outskirts of the Galilee. It's a long walk to get from the Galilee region to Caesarea Philippi, but he takes his disciples up on a mountain, and the reason he does it is he takes them to this pagan city where people are sacrificing to their gods. And it's in this setting that Jesus looks at them and says, Who do you say that I am? Now, here's the thing that you have to understand. Every person on the planet will have to answer that question at some point. Who do you say that I am? And the disciples, just like people in culture, go, well, maybe you're John the Baptist reincarnated. Maybe you're a good teacher. Maybe you're Elijah. And it's Peter who says, no. You're the Christ, the risen one, or you're the Christ, the one from God, the Messiah, the one we've been waiting for this entire time. A remarkable confession. And what's interesting in Luke chapter 9, Jesus says, yes, that's correct. I am he, but I'm going to have to die. It's a really interesting conversation because it's kind of like good news, bad news. The good news is I am the Messiah, is what Jesus is saying. I'm the Messiah. That's the good news. I'm the one you've been waiting for this entire time. That's good news. But for the disciples to hear, I'm going to have to die, oh, that's bad news. That's bad news. I mean, the only way we can really think about it is if I was to come to you and go, hey, if I was to come to you and say, hey, I'm going to write you a check for $20 million, you would be jumping, leaping, just excited, fired up. I'm going to get $20 million. Yeah, that's the good news. But then if I go, but here's the thing. You owe the IRS $100 million. So you'd be elated, and then you'd be like, ugh. This is what's happening with the disciples. So when Jesus takes the three up onto another mountain just 8 days later. He's trying to show them everything that he is. Because he knows that these three are going to be the most significant three in the entire church for the first century. So he goes and he reveals his glory to them. That's really what's happening is he goes and this magnificent moment, this metamorphosis, as Matthew would say, that's the Greek word for transfiguration. This metamorphosis takes place and Jesus in all glory becomes God right there on the mountain. As a matter of fact, those three, John and James and Peter, would actually write about the glory of God in their letters. James talks about the radiance of his glory, this word that's just dripping with divinity. And Peter says the same thing. And John actually says the word became flesh and his glory dwelt among us. What they were witnessing right there in that moment is that Jesus wasn't just a man, but he was God, which was massive. But they almost missed it. I mean, the Bible tells us that these three have walked up a mountain, down a mountain. Then 8 days later, they're back up on a mountain. And I'm sure they're kind of like, Jesus, we love you, but do we have to do any more hikes? They get on that mountain, and what happens? They're heavy with sleep. I mean, I would too. They've probably walked somewhere around 40 to 50 miles in about 10 days. I would be tired too. And the Bible tells us that they're heavy with sleep and they fall asleep. I mean, if you've ever read the Gospels and ever paid attention to how many times these jokers are asleep, all the time. Like, wake up, boys. We got work to do. No, they're sleeping in the corner, and all of a sudden, Moses and Elijah appeared. I mean, think about it for a moment. Think about the miraculous thing that's going on right before them. But they almost missed it because they were asleep. Let me give you a little application for a second. Do you know that you can miss the presence of God? I see it all the time. People miss the presence of God all the time. Sometimes it's because they are so comfortable. In the South, we say they are fat and sassy. They have everything going on in their life. They've got good finances. Their marriage is completely intact. I mean, their kids love Jesus. They've got everything going on. They are so comfortable in their life that they can miss the presence of God. And sometimes they don't even realize it. There are other people who can miss the presence of God because they've got so much going on in their life. They're busy. I mean, just think about the stories in this room. Some of you woke up early and you were worried about the mortgage payment that was due on the 15th. And you're like, I forgot it. I paid ours. I forgot it. How am I going to pay that bill? Some of you woke up this morning and one of your kids was sick and the dress that you put on this morning got ruined because that sickness became on you, if I can speak so gently, right? Some of you walked outside, maybe you had a flat tire. Some of you are worried about the taxes that you've got to pay in a month. Some of you are worried about the sickness that you're walking through. Some of you are worried about the stress that's happening in your job. You have so much going on in your life that you cannot pause for a minute mentally and enjoy the presence of God. You can miss it because you're busy. I mean, remember the story with Jesus, Martha, and Mary? You know, remember that story? Martha was a busybody, just doing everything. Like, listen, let me just give you an insight to the Kennedy household. This is going to sound terrible on video, but I don't care. I'm a Mary. Rachel's a Martha. So on Friday, It's just my day off. I'm just going to hang out, watch some World War II documentaries, maybe hop in the pool. My wife works a full-time job and she's off on Friday too. You know what she did? She made a box that's laser engraved that she could put a blanket that she made in that's monogrammed, along with burp rags that are monogrammed for a shower that she was going to yesterday. Can I tell you, Mary is enjoying life. Martha gets busy. Remember that story? That's what's happening. And Jesus commends Mary and talks to Martha a little sternly, like, slow down, honey. Let's enjoy life together, right? Some of you with your busyness, going here to there, can miss the presence of God. Did you know that every week at 9:15, we have a moment set aside at the church to enjoy the presence of God? And I've been here 2 weeks. It's a sweet, sweet time. I'm enjoying his presence, but sometimes just the busyness of life gets in our way. And then other times we're just overwhelmed with emotional stress, with anxiety, with depression. You can be asleep to the presence of God. But luckily for our disciples, they wake up and they see Moses and they see Elijah talking with Jesus. Now, what's interesting about this story is that it's Moses and Elijah. Have you ever wondered why? Because that's kind of what I do when I read the Bible. I go, why Moses? Why Elijah? I mean, I kind of understand their significance in the Old Testament, but I don't really understand the significance. Well, Moses represented the law and the beginning of a nation. Really, Moses represented beginnings. Elijah, every time we run across Elijah in the Bible, we see this tie to end times. Look at Malachi chapter 4. Here's what it says. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of the father to their children and the hearts of their children to the father, lest I come and strike the land with the decree of utter destruction. So you have Moses who represents beginnings, and you have Elijah who represents the end. And in the middle of it, Jesus is talking about mission. He talks about his departure, and that word departure in the Greek is exodus, which is talking about his exodus. So Jesus is talking about the deliverance and his mission to Moses and Elijah. Whoa! He's going beginning to end and putting his mission right in the middle of it. It's amazing. And like most of us, Peter wakes up. I mean, can you imagine Peter? Hey, John. John. Is that Moses and Elijah? And why does Jesus look like he's on fire? And what does Peter do? He goes, hey, Jesus. Hey, don't you think it'd be cool if we just put a tent here? Look. I'm not asking for me to have a dwelling place. No. But if we could create a tent for Elijah, and if we could create a tent for Moses, and then we have a tent for you, wouldn't that be awesome? We could just stay up here. Now, what's interesting is right about this time was known as the Feast of Tabernacles. And there were all these little tabernacles that represented their exit from the wilderness and how God sustained them in the wilderness. Peter was basically saying, can we just stay here and avoid going back down there? Can we just tabernacle here and never have to engage? Your presence is so, so amazing. This is an amazing moment. We love this moment. This moment is so good. Can we just stay here? And Jesus looks around, cloud comes over them, and Jesus goes, no. Because here's what you have to understand. Running parallel to this story is another story. If you look at Luke chapter 9, the rest of Luke chapter 9, it says that about a day later, there's a dad. And that dad has a son who's having seizures, who's sick, who can't control himself. And this man brings the boy to the group of faith healers. He brings them to the rest of the disciples who are down in the valley, evidently probably teaching and preaching and probably carrying out their normal duties. And this man brings this sick child to the disciples. And they can't do anything. Have you ever had a sick child? Yeah. I got a 17-year-old and an almost 14-year-old. I remember taking Clara for the first time to get her shots. Rachel had to work that day or something, and I had to take Clara, and Clara was small and skinny. She's tall and skinny now, but back then she was tiny, about 6 pounds, just rail thin. And I have a picture that I have in one of the albums, and she has all these Band-Aids all over her thighs because she got her shots that day. But I remember being in the room and that first jab going into her leg. And she looks at me like, what have you done to me? Why, Daddy? Make them stop, Daddy. This isn't fair, Daddy. I can't stand this, Dad. That was the look. And pretty much I would experience it for the next 17 years, like, why, Dad? I remember being powerless in that moment. I've never had a really sick kid. Some of you have. Some of you have held their hand as they're laying in a hospital bed and they're going through chemotherapy. Some of you walk through that. I never have. But I can imagine the powerless feelings that I would have over that. Because as a dad, as a parent, your role is to protect them and to nurture them and to hold on to them. And yet this dad could do nothing. We don't know how far he traveled, but he takes this boy and the disciples can do nothing. So Jesus comes upon the scene about a day later after traveling down from the mountain. He's exasperated at the disciples, and he heals the boy in a miraculous fashion. But listen, the reason God can't stay on the mountain is because there are people hurting in the valley. Do you understand? God never stays on the mountain. The whole point of the incarnation is that he's up in heaven and doesn't think that anybody would ever understand the concept of God. This is what Philippians 2 is all about, that he comes down and he takes on flesh so that he can rescue us. God never stays on the mountain. God always operates in the valley. And listen to me, church. Listen to me carefully. If God doesn't stay on the mountain, neither should we. We are not called for mountaintop experiences. Now, does God operate on the mountain? Absolutely. Does God empower on the mountain? Absolutely. Is his presence felt on the mountain? Absolutely. But the mountain is not where we can live. There's a great book that I read several years ago, and it was talking about a Lutheran church. And I know we're not a Lutheran church, but Heidi Newmark wrote it, and she was writing about this passage specifically. I want you to hear what she says. She says, when Peter and the others came down from the mountain, they found a father and child gasping for life. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father, and they found transfiguration. And so it is when the disciples of the church unlock the doors of their private shelter and step out into the neighborhood. They did meet the distress of the world around them, but they also discovered transformation for themselves and a community. She continues to say this: living up in the rarefied air isn't the point of transformation. It was never meant to be a private experience of spirituality removed from the public square. It was a vision to carry us down, a glimpse of an imagined possibility at ground level. Here's what I know. As beautiful and wonderful and lovely that our spiritual experiences are, they are not created for us, but they are created for the world. If you look at the book of Acts on the day of Pentecost, which we so love and hold dear to, there's this amazing moment that takes place where the sound of a mighty wind comes in and fire sets upon their heart. Just a side note, that's exactly kind of what we see in the wilderness. God led them by a pillar of cloud and a fire by night. And God is saying to the church right there in that moment, I'm going to do it again and I'm going to lead you. He sits upon them and they have this radical moment where they speak in other languages. And have you ever read the last part of that Acts chapter 2 moment? Peter preaches the gospel, 3,000 people get saved. You ever read that? The room that they were in is about maybe a quarter of the size of this room. So how do 3,000 people get saved? It spills out. You see, our moments with Jesus are never supposed to remain here. They're supposed to go outward. And that's what we see in the New Testament church. Acts 1:8, you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Jerusalem and Judea, God was sending them back to a place where they were hated. Just think about it. 50 days prior, they crucified their leader. And God says, I'm going to send you into a place where you're going to be hated. But then he sends them into Samaria. Have you ever wondered what Samaria is? Samaria was the place that they hated the most. So God sends them to a place where they're hated, and then he sends them to a place where they hate. And then he says, you're going to go out into all the world, which was the unknown to them. And so in the book of Acts, what we see is time and time again, the presence of God falls upon them and they go out. The presence of God falls upon them and they go out. The presence of God falls upon them and they go out. You want to know what is going to make Tulare First a healthy church is to encounter the presence of God and then go out. Listen, we cannot keep it indoors. We cannot keep it indoors. We have to start moving outward. If we're going to get from here to there, we've got to start allowing the Spirit of God to fall upon us so that we can go and be empowered to reach our world. Listen, it's not optional. For too long, The church has sat there and said, Rome is burning, the culture's going down the tubes. I'm just going to get into a holy huddle. And that's not the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church is for you to be equipped, discipled, empowered, so you can go win that world. And if we all do this, the promise is that he is with us. He is guiding us. He is leading us.